Hi there, my name is Ellen Jones and I'm a writer, speaker and consultant, and today the lovely people at Jecca Blac asked me to talk about Lesbian Visibility Week and what being a lesbian means to me. I've been out for almost 8 years now and my understanding has changed significantly across time. When I came out, I definitely thought that lesbians were just women who love women, and actually I now understand that lesbianism is a much more complicated and nuanced term that includes non-binary people, that is obviously inclusive of binary trans people. I think what's interesting in my work is that sometimes people have the wrong idea, but it's not because they're bigoted, it's because they just haven't had access to that knowledge. I mean, I grew up not even knowing that lesbians existed. My first encounter with the word lesbian was not through some comprehensive PSHE, but through the Vicar of Dibley. That was the first time I ever learned that the word lesbians existed. I think definitely I felt a lot of shame around being a lesbian because I felt like I was failing my gender in some ways. When you grow up, you're taught that little girls are supposed to be one thing, and I was never that. And I was never really interested in men or any of the feminine things that we're supposed to like growing up. I think a big misconception about lesbians actually is that we are either butch or femme, and those identities have been very historically important and important to some people now, but the idea of them being a binary is just really useless to me. I don't feel like I fit into it. I also feel like there's a misconception around how lesbians can perceive their gender. Lots of lesbians like see their gender as lesbian because either they're trans or non-binary, but also because for so long womanhood has been defined in relation to men because of the patriarchy. And so when you're a lesbian, you sit outside of that, and there's certainly elements of that I can relate to. I think another thing that is really misunderstood is that my identities don't exist in a vacuum. I was talking to someone the other day who's really well educated on inclusion and diversity, and he was saying that he never would have realised that I have to deal with homophobia and misogyny at the same time. I rarely ever experience them separately. I always experience them concurrently, but when we address them in society, we tend to think of them as we'll deal with the homophobia here and we'll deal with the sexism here, but what do you do when it's both at the same time, and how does that specific nuance into play? And I think especially also as a disabled woman as well, people can get really overwhelmed by having to deal with so many intersections and think about so many things. I'm having to deal with it all the time. And the thing that I always say is if people can understand the plot of The Matrix and enjoy it, they can certainly understand holding two concurrent identities at the same time. I think respecting lesbians means understanding that we have a unique experience and unique identities that aren't always representative. And I think some people tend to assume my experiences or assume the experiences of other lesbians that I know. And actually, there's nothing that you know about us based on the label that we use necessarily. Get to know us, get to understand us, and you'd understand the vast nuance as well. I think one of the problems with media representation in particular is that you're often only allowed one lesbian character, if that. And that means that you are forced to present one person. Whereas if we had more representation, we'd be able to have a diversity of experience represented. It would be so much better. It would be so much more realistic. There are lesbians I know who I have nothing to relate to with. Likewise, there are lesbians who I feel like we could be the same person, as I feel like most people do, but because I have an identity that is not widely identified with, we kind of get pigeonholed into this box, whereas I am just a person who loves many things. I think sometimes there's an idea that lesbians are somehow scary and intimidating, when actually a lot of us are just the biggest softies. I find it really fascinating the way that I've certainly seen people move away from my friends and I on the street thinking that we look intimidating, especially when I'm with some of my more butch friends. And it's just this strange interplay of like somehow feeling yourself really intimidated by other people and their responses to you, but also like them feeling scared because they've got this misconception about who you are. What's really interesting to me is also how hypersexualized lesbians are, especially as a disabled person. Autistic people are desexualized, so we're seen as not sexual, not attractive, and lesbians are seen as hypersexual. It's really difficult to type the word lesbian without coming up with pornography. And growing up, that was the only representation I had of myself. And that's really damaging, to be hypersexualized at the age of 14 and to see only sexual representations of yourself. I think it's really damaging, not because pornography is inherently a negative thing, because it's not, but it's also not the only representation of yourself you want to see, and that's where the issue lies. And again, it comes down to seeing more representation and having more representation, holding space for more identities and more diversity. And the thing is, diversity is seen as a risk, even though it isn't a risk by all metrics. We know that having diverse teams, having diverse staff, and including them, inclusion being the most important thing, is really key. And yet it isn't happening because it's somehow seen as a risk to do diverse things. I also want to see not just more lesbians on screen and more lesbians in books and more lesbian on television, but, you know, lesbians consulting, lesbians writing, lesbians being involved in the whole process. And, you know, I want to see butch lesbians, femme lesbians, lesbians who are trans, lesbians who are non-binary, lesbians who are disabled, lesbians who are, you know, black and trans. All these things that we don't see in mainstream media because they're seen as somehow too niche or too obscure. I spend my whole life watching shows and engaging with media that does not represent me. I have never been represented as an autistic lesbian that I have seen. I spend so much of my time empathizing with people who look nothing like me. People need to give themselves more credit that they can understand and empathize with identities that they don't hold, and that's okay. I think lesbian has been such a huge concept that even I struggle to fully encapsulate how broad the experience is and summarize it, because my experiences is going to be completely different to the experiences of someone else. If you do one thing today, make sure I'm not the only video you watch on lesbian visibility. Make sure that you're seeking out lesbian representation in your media, in your films, and think about whether these are accurate portrayals or whether these are stereotypes. And that's not to say stereotypes can't be true, but it's always really apparent to me when authentic representation exists, as opposed to this other kind of idea of what we are and not what we are. As with anything, this is about seeking nuance and finding more voices, and it can be difficult to do, and you're not going to find it immediately in mainstream education. So make a conscientious effort to do better, to find voices that aren't represented, not just of lesbians but of all LGBT people, all marginalized people. Listen, learn, share, grow, unlearn, relearn, change the world. Simple as that, really.